I wanted to show you a few more examples of what personas can look like so that you can get a sense for some of the options that you might consider. You might think about, in this case, we've got a business traveler thinking about how frequently they might travel, because that helps to inform how familiar they might be with your product or parts of your product. Whether or not they are a member of your loyalty program. And then, again, considering how you might surface the fact that there is something that would be compelling for them as part of that loyalty program. And in another example, you might think about really surfacing those goals, those frustrations. But what you're really trying to do is make sure that you are getting a picture that gives you enough information about who the persona is, your user is, to inform the design decision making that you're going to be doing. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about empathy maps. So essentially, empathy maps are a tool that you can use in parallel or in conjunction with a persona in order to create a shared understanding of their needs and aid in decision making. And again, once you've got a persona, you can create an empathy map to essentially walk through the process of a user having a particular interaction with a product or a feature or even a service, and understand what their perspective is, what they say, think, do, and feel. And that can again help you to understand what you can do to create compelling experiences as well. And here, the steps to create a persona are, again, you target one persona, you define exactly what it is that you want to understand as part of that, the process of creating an empathy map. And typically it is a focus on a point or an interaction in a customer journey. I'm saying schedule a live conversation or an interview to really gather information from people who align with the attributes and motivations and goals and experiences of your personas, so that you can really get a sense for what are they saying about this particular process. And this can be either a thought exercise, or you can have them actually walk through what it is like to actually experience that interaction. And finally, what you can do is make sure that you've got your stakeholders there listening in so they can hear that perspective, and maybe even contribute to doing some of the synthesis of the data that you pull from that interaction. And then you create a deliverable that, again, can look something like this, where you're thinking about making a representation of what people, think, hear, feel, and do, and use things like sticky notes. If you were in a physical location, you would actually use a whiteboard and sticky notes and kind of do a brainstorming session where you're working together to create these findings together. These days, people are often using virtual whiteboard software in order to pull this off, and sometimes it can even go faster in a virtual setting. So, what are you doing when you are creating the data to support your personas? The first piece is really about getting some quantitative data, if you can, that helps you to understand the scope and scale. So how many people you want to focus, you might want to focus on the 80%, so the most frequent users, or you might want to focus on the 20%, the least frequent users, but who might be more valuable to your company. It all makes, in the conversations that you're having with your stakeholders, you want to make sure that you are surfacing those personas that are most important to you. And those might be personas that actually represent numerically a very small group of people. Then the qualitative information that you bring in is really about helping to create narrative and story and provide some depth. So again, understanding why those people have those attitudes, behaviors, and characteristics, and really getting descriptive so you can create those empathy maps, those scenarios that help to inform what it is that your personas are experiencing as people. So now let's shift gears to talk about how do you create interviews that help to inform your personas. So we typically see interviews consisting of about 20 open questions or so. So it doesn't have to be exactly 20. It can go run a little bit longer or shorter, but it all depends on how big the questions that you're asking people are. Sometimes you have questions that take a minute to answer, and sometimes you have questions that take 5 minutes to answer. It's really important to develop a rapport so that you can elicit information that is valuable with people. And so just think through what method you might want to use. You can use a moderated test where you have a person who is live and essentially in the room with the users who can conduct an interview that's very nuanced and can actually shift gears on the fly to help understand in a really some potentially deep, complex questions. And then on the opposite side, you might want to do an unmoderated interview as well. We can talk a little bit more about some of the considerations that you might have when you're thinking through picking one of those methods. You always, just with any good research, must think about what it is you need to get out of those interviews. So what information must you gather so that you can be successful in creating, your personas, and then what's kind of a nice to know, good to know. And then finally, the most important piece is you have to use language and process that really is natural to the people that you are talking to so that they can answer on their own terms. So you have to be careful about using jargon with them. Ask them how they think about different topics that you want to cover with them. So in general, the way that you want to set up an interview is really intentional. And you want to think about what the general flow of that interview might be. And I always think about it as there's a certain number of questions that come in a certain order that helps you to get where it is that you need to go by the end of the interview. You want to start with an introduction, make sure that you've got a few questions that enable you to build rapport. Then you want to ask the most important questions first so that you make sure that you have enough time to get the critical questions answered. Then you can explore more with those deep focus questions. And then in the wrap up, give yourself space to maybe go back and think a little bit more about what feedback they've already given. And also potentially once they've said all those things, people can surprise you with some additional feedback that they may not have shared previously, because they are also synthesizing what it is that they're saying and processing. And so often people will come to the end of the conversation, and that will be a great moment to be surprised and learn things that you hadn't anticipated knowing. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about each of the sections. So the first is obviously the introduction and warm up. And so here what you want to do is make sure that you're setting expectations about the conversation and what you're going to be asking people to do and what the intent is around the research that you're doing. I also love to ask questions about people's recent experiences that help to provide some context around how they might use your feature or function, or what their needs are in the space that you are considering designing for. And you really want to be specific. So you want to ask not the in general, how do you do this? Or in general, what do you do in the morning? But you really want to say, so what did you do yesterday morning when you got up? And then follow up with, was that normal for you? And in that way, you can get actually specific stories from them and get an understanding and build to whether or not that's something that is an in general for them or how unique that experience was. The next thing you should think about, so as I said, you want to put the important questions first. I always think about ranking the questions that I have. So I'm not saying that you don't have all the questions there in front of you as the moderator, but what you can do is essentially prioritize the questions that you have. And I think of gold, silver, bronze. So the gold questions are ones that everybody should answer and be able to answer. So everybody's had that experience and has some wisdom to share about that. And then the silver and bronze questions are a little bit like icing. They're nice to have and they help to add clarity and give you a little bit more depth, but it's okay if not everybody gets asked those questions. There are a number of different question types, but I think probably the ones that you're going to use most frequently in the context of a persona are going to be grand tour, mini tour, example, experience, and native language type questions. And that's because you're going to use that to help to inform your personas, you know, in a very tactical way. So the grand tour questions are really about, tell me a story about how your context of use. Mini tour might be, tell me a little bit more, give me a little bit more detail about a part of that experience. So where it is, you might originally start out with, so tell me how it is that you shop for shoes. A mini tour question would be like, so you said that you would go to a website and want to spend a bit of time comparing different types of shoes. Tell me a little bit more about that experience. Then example questions. So again, this is, you know, asking people to cherry pick either a good or a bad or maybe even indifferent example of when they experienced a certain challenge or were trying to achieve a certain goal that you're interested in understanding more about. Then you can do experience questions. So essentially, again, asking about an experience that people had, and then eliciting information about the natural language that they use to describe concepts. So the other thing that I like to do is, before I even start the interview process, have a templatized version of the persona in front of me and essentially align each one of the interview questions with a section of that persona so that I know that I'm getting information that I can use to fill out that section of the persona. So I always think about, how do you create compelling reports? The best reports are actually co-created with the questions that you are going to answer and the prompts that you're going to have people respond to as they are walking through an interaction with you as an interview or in a usability test. Then in the wrap-up space, what you want to do, again, is make sure that you are thanking people for their time, that you are, you know, conveying that you're very appreciative of their feedback and that it will be used. And again, you want to make sure that you are carving out space so that people can surface information that they want to, now that they've had a little bit more time to process. So as I noted earlier, you can do moderated or unmoderated tests. With unmoderated tests, this is a moment where you actually have people walk through a script without having a moderator there. So imagine it's just me talking to a blank screen. And these interviews are going to be highly structured because you don't have a moderator there who can follow up and probe. So you have to be very conscious of how it is that you're asking people questions, because you're not going to be able to recover if you're asking questions using jargon and they don't understand. The other piece is that you don't have to just use unmoderated interviews as a means of, you know, having people talk, but you can also have them do a little bit of show and tell. So ask them to actually walk through the experience of buying those shoes online, for example. I think the most compelling reason to do an unmoderated test is you remove the potential for having moderator bias. So, expressions on people's faces can sometimes actually undermine the quality of the interview because people feel judged. So people tend to be very truthful when there isn't somebody there reacting to them. And you want to make sure that you're sprinkling in different types of question choices so that people get some variety. It gets boring sometimes just talking to a blank screen. So you might add written questions in, or rating scale questions, or multiple choice questions, which also has a side benefit of creating for you structured information that takes a little bit less time to go back and analyze. And finally, also, you want to be upfront with people when you are screening that they will be doing an interview, so that they have a sense for whether or not they want to spend their time with you in that exercise. So I did just want to give you an example script. So what does this look like? In this case, we've got about 23 questions. This is an unmoderated interview script. And you can see these first questions here are essentially about creating rapport, which is still important in an unmoderated setting. Then describing what their most recent experience was. So this is what is called a generative interview, where you're really trying to get an understanding of user needs and current unmet, sometimes unarticulated needs. Then you dig a little bit deeper, get some of those more pointed questions, more deep focused questions, and then at the end, wrap up. So share feedback they haven't had a chance to yet. Give a little bit of chance to get creative with you, and then thank them. All right. So a moderated interview is great for when you need nuance and conversation. They're very flexible. The other piece is that it enables you to sometimes do show and tell, but the behind the scenes. So if you have something that's very sensitive that you don't want outside of the four walls, doing a moderated test is a great way to get around that barrier. The other piece that's really lovely about moderated interviews is that oftentimes you can include other people in that conversation, and that moderator can serve as a conduit that can help to share additional questions or follow-ups that the team might be interested in live. And then you do have to make sure that you set expectations for everybody who's going to be in the room, both the moderator, any observers that you might have, note takers, and the participants, so that everybody is informed about what's going on and kind of what the rules of the road are going to be for that time. I get a lot of questions about whether or not it's okay to be inconsistent with interview scripts. And in my experience, if you're going to be doing a series of interviews with 8 to sometimes even 15 people, you've got some space to actually evolve your script in between interviews. So I often think about, the first, interview is really a chance for you to pilot test and kind of stress test the script itself. And then you can think about those next several interviews as a means of exploring and understanding more about the landscape, then moving on to understand a little bit more about the themes that you uncovered during that first round of interviews. So really, you might shift gears a little bit and really focus in one particular area versus casting a wider net to understand more about the landscape. And then finally, towards the end of the round of interviews that you're doing, you can go back and validate what it is that you've learned. So understand those themes a little bit more deeply, or even sometimes shift gears again and shift to another theme that you didn't learn more about earlier in the interview process. It all just needs to make sense. So since you're creating stories, you need to get just enough data to get a good understanding of what's going on with your participants. So I always love to speak about making sure that you're creating a great experience for your participants as well during the interview process. And so making sure that you are being non-judgmental, that you're being friendly and approachable, but yet also not being overly talkative, so that people can have a chance to speak and feel comfortable about what it is that they're sharing with you. I think it's really important to be very aware of what your expectations are going in, because you don't want to reinforce what your sometimes flawed expectations might be. And listen. I think being a good listener is really hard. And sometimes listening means waiting and watching and being quiet. Sometimes it means reflecting back what it is that someone said to you as a means of validating what it is that they've said and making them comfortable with sharing with you. I do think that it's really critical to try to do this as a team. So as much as you can, include the stakeholders who are actually going to be using personas as a part of the data collection as well as data synthesis process. And then I think most important of all, while users might be wrong sometimes, you don't have to expose that fact to them. So it may be that they're telling you something that you know is incorrect, but listen to them, because it can tell you a lot about their perceptions. And rather than just thinking about the fact that, you know, they disagree with something that you understand and think is true, really dig into why their perspective is the way that it is, because there's probably a good reason for that, and it can help you to get more creative in addressing their needs. So finally, I think that it's really important that you think about the fact that people are not going to tell you exactly what it is they need. And doing design thinking means that you have to create empathy with your users in a really thoughtful way, and do it on a consistent basis, because it's the best way to get innovative about both discovering and then meeting some of those unarticulated and unmet needs. That helps you to create designs and products and features that are compelling and that actually really reflect the fact that people have needs that to date haven't been covered yet. So I love this quote because it helps you to get people to understand that it's really important to listen to what it is that people need. And personas are a great way of essentially creating a picture of what those needs are. So thank you so much for listening in today, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.